all of them, they understand that gold is money, but it's not this crude fetishism of gold of, because it's yellow and shiny, or because it has to be gold, that it has to be money. It's an understanding of the fact that if left to the free market, gold emerges as money. Gold is valued and chosen as a store of value because the physical properties that it has help it to gain that. But the reason that it is money is not any one particular physical property. It's the fact that that is what emerges out of people's decisions. And so, the Austrians understand that gold should be money, but fundamentally they're not wedded to the idea of gold or silver as money. They're wedded to the idea of a free market choice in money. And that's the definition of sound money. It's money whose value and acceptability is emergent on the market. People accept it at a value that they choose, not a value imposed by third parties. So for me, this is really why Bitcoin matters, because it fulfills these criteria for being sound money. It is hard money in that its supply can't be increased, and that's, I think, is the most interesting aspect of it. And it's even harder than gold in that regard, because gold you can always dig deeper and find more, but Bitcoin you'll never get more than 21 million. And this hardness, just like in the case of gold, is what gives it that ability to play the role of money. And so this is why I think it's very interesting and worth looking at. Where it has an advantage over gold is really, and then that's the raison d'etre why Bitcoin was invented. And if we were still on a gold standard, I'm 100% certain we would not have had Bitcoin invented. There would be no motivation for it. The difference that it has between gold, is not in it's obviously the physical characteristics of gold are maybe an advantage that it can be held or so on, but the other advantage that it's not physical means that its clearance all over the world doesn't have to be centralized. It's far more decentralized as a settlement and clearance layer. And so it being decentralized makes it much harder to confiscate, much harder to co-opt. If you think about how gold's monetary role was restricted, it happened through governments taking over central banks. And central banks, to a large extent, there was a real market demand for central banking with gold, because moving physical gold around with every transaction is not very convenient. But using settlement of physical gold has enormous economies of scale when banks are able to settle payments with one another. So that led to the centralization of gold reserves around more and more centralized banks, till we got to the point where effectively we only have one central bank in the world today, the US central bank, which holds an enormous amount of gold. Bitcoin, effectively, by making the final layer of settlement, the final layer of clearance of payments, much more decentralized and much cheaper than gold, will, instead of us having a few central banks at the top, Bitcoin would have hundreds or thousands or maybe tens of thousands of entities that can function as central banks, that can function as a final layer of settlement. And thus, it becomes a much more difficult entity for governments to control. So I think, if you value sound money, if you value the ability of market if you want money that emerges on the market, you should probably be interested in this. I'm not saying this is a pitch for people to invest in it. I don't particularly care if people invest or not, and I don't think Bitcoin. I'm not trying to sell people on Bitcoin. I think if it's going to win, it's going to continue to succeed because of its economic properties, and not because I'm going on TV and on the internet and telling people to buy it. So I think it's just the economic reality of it will likely enforce itself if it is worthwhile or not. Venezuela, if it sets an example for Venezuela that more and more Venezuelans start moving, let's say, towards Bitcoin, then it forces a bankruptcy of the current socialist kleptocracy in Venezuela. And then a new government that comes along in Venezuela will know that, if we mess around, people can just defect from here to Bitcoin. Maybe Bitcoin doesn't end up being adopted all over the world. Maybe it doesn't end up being a new monetary standard, but it acts as a sort of, the metaphor I gave is a sort of monetary Batman lurking in the shadows of every society, so that, anytime a government begins to inflate, people can just start moving towards it. And as they start moving towards it, because the supply is limited, the value rises. So it's a very attractive notion for people to start jumping onto it. So maybe it's just going to be this, this bad guy that is going to force discipline on governments.